Well, good morning, everybody. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Hope everybody had a good sleep. Everybody have a good sleep? Good? Well, I believe, are we online yet? We're good to go. Welcome, everybody online joining us. We hope you had a good sleep, too. My name is Kevin Dunn. I'm your MC for the weekend. If you missed us last night, welcome to I Will Not Abandon You. This is the 2022 Canadian Physicians for Life annual conference. We have a great number of people here at the Bessborough in Saskatoon. A number of you online. We're so pleased to have you with us this morning. Now, last night, I just want to say before we begin how wonderful it is. I know I can only speak. I'm still, you know, when you're in a medical setting, I'm a filmmaker. Trying to get a hold of some of the terminology is one thing. But the greater thing for me is just being with people of like mind, of like spirit, of care and of concern. It's good for the soul. So, thank you for being here, and thank you for joining us online. I hope it gives you, and I think I speak for Nicole and CPL as well, that inspiration to carry on the good work that you're doing and to dialogue, as Charlie Camosi was talking last night. Can we restore the value of fundamental human equality to modern medicine? What a great title for his talk. He spoke about the move from bodily autonomy to reproductive autonomy and the ethical dangers to this move. He spoke multiple examples of how the interpretation of another's quality of life continues to drive the narrative, our self-imposed interpretation of quality of life. He called on us to raise the alarm and speak out clearly, to have no shame for having a theological point of view, and that this is absolutely necessary. He reminds us that that dementia has not been politicized, and that this might be a bridge for a dialogue. We see all these other, medical aid and dying, euthanasia, abortion politicized, but dementia has not been politicized yet. That is an opportunity for dialogue. He spoke of 3 steps we could take, the call of us as individuals, families, communities. Here, I think of all of us gathered here and online to have these conversations. And the passion that we heard in the questions last night, we encourage you to continue your questions because they drive the narrative as well. The call to build dialogue. Here I think of CPL, Canadian Physicians for Life. I think of Ray Penning's, Cardis and his new health initiative, their new health initiative. I think of Blaze and the work of CCBR, and so many others here today, building that dialogue, something we need. And what if we fail? Time for the church to be the church, reclaim its rightful place as a truly compassionate caregiver. A reminder of our call. So, folks, I hope you are enjoying the conference so far. A reminder once again to fill out your survey about Charlie's talk last night. And again, with all the talks today, you'll find it in your package here. I think it's right in the first page there. You'll see it, event survey. So please do fill it out because each year this conference gets better and better, and that is the result of hearing what you have to say. Coming up, we have session 2, legal issues in healthcare, conscience and critical care. Nicole, we have 2 panelists today, or 2 speakers. Nicole Scheidl serves as the Executive Director of Canadian Physicians for Life. We heard from her last night. She has a law degree from Osgoode Hall School and is a master's in law from Queen's University. She will also be joined by Quentin Genuis, who is an emergency physician and ethicist based in Vancouver. He has academic and research interests that include human dignity, the autonomy debates, end-of-life care, and compassion and moral injury. They will be discussing the legal framework for conscience in healthcare and how it applies in the healthcare setting. Please welcome Nicole and Quentin.
Thank you very much. I'm so excited to actually present on a topic that's near and dear to my heart. So let's see if we can get this moving here. Oh, just a second. So many of you may think, oh, that's my lovely family, just in case you want to see what they look like. There is a lot of them, it's true. Yeah. Good? Okay. So just some disclosures, I don't have any conflicts of interest. There's no big drug companies paying me to speak on this topic. I'm really sad about that, but that's the way it is. What we're going to try and do today is talk about conscience. I'm going to talk to you about it from a legal framework, because even though you may feel like this is a settled issue in Canadian law, it's not at all. So I want to talk to you a little bit about what that looks like right now and how we might create a dialogue around that. And then Quentin will talk to you more about the practical things of in healthcare, in the hospitals, how working with using your conscience or making conscience decisions plays out in real life. So, doctors should just do what they're told. That was the response that I heard to a motion for physician conscience rights at the Ontario Progressive Conservative Policy Convention in 2019. We had submitted a motion to the Policy Convention to protect and support physician conscience rights, and it had been denied by the organizers. They would not let us bring that motion forward. So using the Robert's rules, we brought it up from the floor. And the organizers were really angry. And one of them got up to speak against the motion and said, physicians should just do what they're told. And I thought, wow, should Nelson Mandela just have done what he was told and said that apartheid was okay? Or should Malala Yousafzai just have done what she was told and said that girls should not be educated? And if you just accept that people should just do what they're told, who should do the telling? The government? The powerful? I don't think any of us find that acceptable. We know where that leads. So conscience in Canada has a moral meaning. And as uncomfortable as that may be in our current climate, it is worth grappling with. So freedom of religion and freedom of expression have been frequently litigated in the Canadian courts, but freedom of conscience has not, or it has been sidestepped. Canadian legal scholars often refer to freedom of conscience as the forgotten freedom. So in order to understand this forgotten freedom, I want to unpack that a little bit. So first of all, I want you to note that freedom of conscience is a freedom and not a right. And there's a significant textual difference in law between freedoms and rights. A charter freedom marks out a sphere of sovereignty, a place that's not subject to the determination of the state. It's supposed to act as a shield against state action. And it's a place where the individual is supposed to be free, because the individual predates the state, and so it's an area that the state is not supposed to get into. And the roots of that thinking are thousands of years old. But the Western tradition with its deep roots has produced a lot of thinkers in that area, like Thomas Aquinas, Aristotle. Like, we see that thinking all the way through, shot through our Western tradition. And so the Canadian Charter of Freedoms did not spring out of nowhere. It comes from a long line of constitutional traditions and rights instruments. We have the English constitutional tradition, the French, the American, and the jurisprudence in Canada draws from all of that. We also have the events of the 20th century. We have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Those foundational precursors to our Canadian Charter of Rights came out of World War II. So after World War II and the horror of the Holocaust, the world, for a brief moment of time, before the Iron Curtain came down, there was this brief moment of time where we had worldwide agreement on a set of rights. And so that's where we got the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So in that Universal Declaration, and Eleanor Roosevelt played a big part in that, and actually, interestingly, the Universal Declaration was written by a Canadian, just so you can feel a little proud of that. Article 1 says that Human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. And in Article 18, it says everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. So you see that kind of language appearing in our charter. And in our charter, Section 2 says everyone has the following fundamental freedoms: freedom of conscience and religion, and then thought, belief, peaceful assembly, and association. So one of the first cases after the charter was passed in 1982, which looked at Section 2A, because there's very few cases that have looked at Section 2A, was the Big M Drug Mart case. And that case before the Supreme Court came out of Alberta, it was an action against the Lord's Day Act. So way back then, and some of you will remember that, stores had to close on Sunday. They couldn't be open because of the Lord's Day Act. So Big M Drug Mart said that was a violation of their religious freedoms, and they went to the Supreme Court over it. But some interesting language in that case talked about conscience. And the Justice Dixon said that freedom must surely be founded in respect for the inherent dignity and the inviolable rights of the human person. And he went on to observe that at the heart of our democratic political tradition is an emphasis on individual conscience and individual judgment. And so the ability of each citizen to make free and informed decisions is the absolute prerequisite for the legitimacy, acceptability, and efficacy of our system of self-government. It is because of the centrality of the rights associated with freedoms of individual conscience, both to basic beliefs about human worth and dignity, and to a free and democratic political system, that American jurisprudence has emphasized the primacy or firstness of the First Amendment, and it is this same centrality that, in my view, and this is the Chief Justice speaking, underlies their designation in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms as fundamental. They are the sine qua non of the political tradition underlying the Charter. So when this case came out, you might be quite hopeful as to how conscience rights would be litigated in Canadian law. So Big M went on to say a little bit more about the principles and objects on creating a cohesive understanding of Section 2. But because they didn't go further, and we haven't had case law since then, it's been pretty problematic for the development of jurisprudence around conscience rights in Canada. But what we can conclude from the Big M case is that there's a connection within the structure of fundamental freedoms to individual conscience, personal judgment, human dignity, democratic participation, and free and informed decision-making. So let's just put the case law to the side for a second and think about what is conscience. So I know, like, Quentin has all this, like, Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle, and he's really a deep thinker on this, and I have Pinocchio and the Prince with the devil and the, actually, who is that guy? Sorry? Kronk. Okay, yes, thank you. I recognize him from what my kids watched on TV, but I don't know his name, with the devil on one side and the angel on the other. So you might have this kind of, in the culture, that's how we see conscience displayed. And sometimes that's pretty thin. It's hard to develop a really great framework about thinking about your conscience. So I want to introduce you to a couple of favorite authors of mine. One of them is Cormac Burke. And he said that conscience appears as a guardian of personal integrity. It is like an alarm system that enters into spontaneous action whenever our way of acting can influence the type of person we are becoming. And another leading thinker on conscience is Joseph Ratzinger. He has a great book called On Conscience, which is very helpful for thinking about this subject. In it, he speaks quite eloquently about the duty to develop our conscience by entering into the search for truth. So we see in those definitions of Cormac Burke's and Joseph Ratzinger's that conscience is connected to personal integrity and to the act of personal development or identity. And personal integrity is developed by the moral commitments that I hold myself to. In a way, I create my measuring stick and I measure my actions against it. And those are only really compelling when the objects that I've chosen as what I'm measuring myself against are capital T truth. They are some objective good. So Jocelyn McClure and Charles Taylor argue that these core or meaning-giving convictions and commitments are distinguishable from other personal beliefs and preferences because of the role they play in an individual's moral identity. So there is this idea in the literature about forming our conscience that we develop our moral identity. And in order to form and develop, we need freedom to act in accordance with our deeply held beliefs, but also to test those beliefs against reason and experience and dialogue with others. Conscience is also important for truth-seeking, and legal scholars have argued that the reason for the protection of conscience rights is the necessity of truth-seeking as an inherently human action. So Derek Ross writes a lot on this. He is the executive director of Christian Legal Fellowship. He's doing a lot of work in the conscience area. And he points to the Supreme Court of Canada's decision in Ross in New Brunswick. And this was a freedom of expression case, but it makes an interesting point. In that case, the Supreme Court says, ours is a free society built upon a foundation of diversity of views. It is also a society that seeks to accommodate this diversity to the greatest extent possible. Such accommodation reflects an adherence to the principle of equality, valuing all divergent views equally and recognizing the contributions that a wide range of beliefs may make in the search for truth. And so we see truth claims throughout the foundational documents that I talked about earlier, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all those other constitutional documents. And it creates a bit of a problem because we have all these truth claims about human nature and the claims about what the good is. And the Supreme Court again, our Supreme Court again says, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. But if we say there is no truth, and you hear that argument now in our culture, on what basis is there protection for human rights? What can you ground it in? So acknowledging that truth, the existence of truth, does not necessarily settle the content or the meaning, which is why the freedom to seek the truth is so important as a human endeavor. So in Veritatis Splendor, which was a document written by John Paul II when he was Pope, identified that protecting this core truth-seeking function of the human conscience is increasingly perceived as the foundation of the cumulative rights of the person, because the ability to develop and act upon one's moral judgment based on one's understanding of truth is a precondition to the exercise of other freedoms. So as I develop my conceptions of what is right and good and true, I'm developing my conscience and binding myself. I'm also creating my own measuring stick that I am constraining my actions and also compelling myself to act in a certain way. And we saw this with Oskar Schindler. He said that he could not stand by and see people destroyed. He did what he could and what he had to do because his conscience told me he must do it. So really, when you develop your conscience, you are compelled to act in a certain way. And so that is the way we're wired. It's a fundamental principle of natural law. And these understandings of the good form a core element of our human identity and operate as an organizing principle for ourselves. Because when we're forced to do what we see as evil, we experience moral distress and soul-shattering trauma. I think that was so brought home to me last week when I watched the Committee for Veterans Affairs having the veterans witnesses talk about their experience of PTSD from their service in Afghanistan and in Africa, and the absolute moral distress and the soul-shattering trauma that they had gone through and how it had affected them. So this idea of the pursuit of truth was reiterated by Justice Leroux-Dubé in Irwin-Toy in Quebec. This is another Supreme Court decision in 1989. Frankly, after the 1980s, we've kind of lost the thread on this, but there is some good case law in the 1980s. And she said that one of the eminent goals of the Charter included the pursuit of knowledge and truth as a basic purpose. So we have the courts saying again and again that the pursuit of truth is an integral part of our charter. But what is truth? Maybe some of you remember Pontius Pilate asking that question, and it's kind of reverberated through the centuries. But truth-seeking is a human endeavor, not a state endeavor. And so the state has to have some humility in creating this space for this most human of endeavors. For example, Professor Bruce Ryder, in referring to the Charter's preamble, says that the state should have a kind of secular humility, a recognition that there are other truths, other sources of competing worldviews, of normative and authoritative communities that are profound sources of meaning in people's lives that ought to be nurtured as counterbalances to state authority. So I don't know about you, but I don't take the profound meaning of my life from any politician and what they say or what the state says. There's other communities we have in our lives where we draw that from. So inherent in this approach is a recognition that truth may be impossible to fully attain. We are continuously learning, and the point is to create a space of freedom for truth-seeking. But this doesn't mean that the government can never legislate in furtherance of a vision of what is right and just and good. Truth claims are inevitable in lawmaking. When the government says something is illegal, they're saying it's wrong. And when they say something is legal, they're saying it's right. You can just look at what happened with drug decriminalization. I don't know about where you live, but in my city, the smell of cannabis is now the prevailing scent in the downtown area. And that was not the case prior to decriminalization. And I know that Dr. John Mayer, when he was talking here last year, talking about euthanasia being extended to those with mental illness, that many of his patients, he's a psychiatrist, he said many of his patients were saying, well, once it's legal and a doctor can do it, then it's okay. And they were just waiting. So there's a lot of moral framing around when things are now legal. And the Charter, in the natural law tradition, ethics can be discerned through the use of our reason. Individuals also use religious beliefs as a touch point to confirm that their reason is accurate. And the Charter claim to conscience is a claim to exercise public moral reasoning. We get to think out our moral position, act on our moral conclusions, resist being forced to act against them, and also, importantly, attempt to convince others that certain actions are right or wrong. I have a friend who practices estate law, and this year he was made the power of attorney for health care for one of his clients. He really didn't want to do it because it really doesn't fit with a lawyer to be your client's health care POA. But she had no one else, so he agreed. And at one point, she was very sick in the hospital, and she wanted MAID. And they had this extensive dialogue about the rightness of this decision. Like, he really argued with her about moral right and wrong. And he was able to get her to move to a hospice, and she died peacefully there on February 12th of this year. But moral reasoning is difficult, both for the reasoning process involved and for the emotions that moral debate necessarily generates. In our current climate, where emotions range supreme, moral reasoning is even more fraught. In the case of my friend, it wasn't his client who was emotional about the dialogue, but the head nurse, who pulled him out of the room and said, "You can't talk to my patient like that. You're upsetting her, talking to her about heaven and hell and last things, and you just got to stop." And he said, "No, I'm here because this is our relationship, this is what we talk about, and I'm going to keep doing it." So conscience claims are complex. And it is one reason why, in most cases, the courts have defaulted to deciding cases on religious grounds and not conscience grounds. It is a bit like divorce court, actually. The legislation around family law and divorce was changed to no-fault divorce because the courts did not want to decide which spouse was right and which spouse was wrong. They just wanted it clean. So 1 year, you've been separated, you can get your divorce. We don't want to wade into that. And so in religious claims, the courts do not wade into whether or not a claim has merit. They have a test about sincerity of belief, but stop short of moral reasoning. But freedom of conscience is not the same as religious freedom. The social goods are different. In freedom of religion, the social good is to allow citizens with widely varying religious or non-religious beliefs to live in harmony simply by a process of mutual tolerance and reasonable accommodation. Its primary social goal is to eliminate religious strife. But freedom of conscience has different considerations. The category is broader and is even more fundamental to democracy. It is an essential part of a functioning democracy where the very lifeblood of the system relies on our moral discernment. However, with conscience claims, it is inevitable that my claim is seen as a criticism of your moral conclusions, if they're different. The message is clearly that I send is by refusing to act because of a moral objection, I'm saying that your moral stance is wrong. Thus, the courts have characterized this as an injury to the dignity of the other. If that injury to dignity is sufficient to constitute discrimination, then conscience claims are bound to fail. And this was the central problem with the court's approach in the CPSO case, which I'm sure you're all really familiar with. The court seemed to see the objection of performing an effective referral as purely a personal preference, perhaps grounded in religious dogma. But they did not engage on the conscience issue. In fact, they put it aside. They said, we don't have to decide on conscience, we're just going to decide on religion. So they decided on the religious grounds, but in that decision, they found that even though the charter rights of the physicians were violated, it could be saved by Section 1 because of the dignitary harm that may result to a person who was not given the service they requested, and because that possibility of some patient somewhere might have dignitary harm done to them, that was enough to override the charter rights of the physicians. So Marianne Waldron is a great constitutional scholar out in BC, and if you ever get a chance to read some of her stuff, it's well worth reading on the conscience issue. And she says, in Canada, we are faced with the unwillingness of the courts to give any value to the protection of minority conscience rights where they impact the dignity of others to any degree, or to recognize that conscience claims are not merely matters of personal fulfillment or private interest. And because the physician-patient relationship is one of vulnerability, the impact on dignity is amplified. I think that is one of the reasons why we come to that statement said with such conviction at the policy convention in Ontario in 2019 that doctors should just do what they're told. So there is hope, though. So what can we do to restore freedom of conscience to its rightful place in Canadian jurisprudence? So Marianne Waldron sets out 4 steps, which I think is a really great framework for us to start this dialogue. So the first thing is the courts would need to properly identify claims that are conscience claims. Because conscience claims engage the moral realm, the courts would have to recognize that there's an appropriate moral dialogue happening in the public square and let it happen. Secondly, the courts would need to adopt a position of ideological neutrality in determining whether conscience claims should receive protection. This is maybe the hardest thing for the courts to do. Conscience can receive no protection where courts not only disagree with the conclusions of the conscientious objector, but cannot even acknowledge that they're legitimate. Moral imagination is required by the courts in this case. The courts would also need to develop a balanced approach to moral pluralism. Conclusions of moral reasoning make universal claims. This means that my conscience claim necessarily passes judgment on your act and can cause at least annoyance, anger, maybe even shame. But if those feelings of hurt and rejection are sufficient to rule out my rights, freedom of conscience becomes useless in any area of life that does not reflect the moral conclusions of our judiciary. And what use is freedom of conscience if it means only the freedom to agree with the conscience of the powerful? The powerful do not need conscience protection. We can think of that famous dialogue between Athens and Milos. The powerful do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. And finally, the courts would need to consider our hierarchy of conscience rights. Not every exercise of conscience can or should receive complete judicial and legal protection. Freedom of conscience in the Charter is to protect the place of serious moral and ethical debates in a democratic society. Conscience claims that do not reflect the results of serious moral or ethical reasoning should receive little or no protection. So ad hominem attacks, defamation, or efforts to stir up hatred and violence against particular individuals or groups really do not qualify as conscience claims. So in the CPSO case, the harm the courts weighed against was this right against the right to resist coercion was primarily that of the court's own conception of imagined dignitary harm to an imaginary patient. So if the doctor could refuse to participate in euthanasia, that somehow was going to harm the dignity of the person. The problem with this focus on dignitary harm is that it is purely subjective and incapable of measurement. And it's also really shaky ground for the curtailment of freedoms. So in conclusion, as physicians, your interaction with your patients must be tender. This interaction of law and medicine is shot through with the opportunity for moral disagreement and lies open to claims of dignitary harm. But the sensitivity of the physician, the development of the physician-patient relationship allows for truth-telling with tenderness.
Thanks, Nicole. I don't have a ton of stuff to say because I was hoping we could have some good time for Q&A, but I just had a few reflections on what you said there. I think it can be very intimidating for physicians to think about conscience and the so-called conscience rights conversations in our time. And I think it can be intimidating because we perceive ourselves in a tension. On one hand, I think we understand increasingly that violation of one's conscience is a depersonalizing, dehumanizing, and traumatic thing to do. And I experienced this. I work at St. Paul's Emergency Department in downtown Vancouver. We deal with a lot of very tragic and morally complex situations and violent patients and having to escort patients out of the emergency department when they might be very sick. And those kinds of things can cause moral distress. And I was having some beers with some of my nursing colleagues at St. Paul's, and several of them said to me, 2 or 3 beers in, but not ironically or as a joke, we feel dead inside because of some of the things we've had to do and been asked to do in our role. And I think increasingly they are feeling, and we can understand and relate to the ways that violating your conscience can lead to moral distress and significant depersonalization. But on the other hand, we also don't want this to be a hill that we die on. And I'm interested in having a long medical career and seeing patients and not getting into fights with college, and I don't want to be on the front page of global news or whatever it is. And so we face a real tension. We don't want to violate our conscience, but also a lot of the time we want appropriately to fly under the radar, so to speak, in an appropriate relational space with our patients. One of the very few things that I remember from high school is my social studies teacher had a big poster up on the wall in our classroom that said, "Choose a hill to die on, make it a high one." And I find that very compelling, actually, is all of us should have the courage to have hills that we're willing to die on. But there is also wisdom to trying to do the goods of our day-to-day life without dying on every hill, which can sacrifice our ability to do a lot of the good things that we do. So certainly in my practice, I want not to violate my conscience, but also I don't want to get into fights and spats with every patient that end up violating my ability to do what I do. This is some of the reason that we often find the conscience conversation intimidating in our time. I have a few ideas that can help us navigate these murky waters. First, I will talk about the space between ourselves and our patients and dovetail on some things that Nicole said. And then secondly, I want to briefly talk about the space between ourselves and our colleagues or our profession. So first of all, between ourselves and our patients, I think one of the poverties that our time suffers in the doctor-patient space is the poverty of seeing that as primarily a transactional space. And so the history of medicine, in the, I would say, a more venerable tradition, sees the space between a doctor and a patient as a relational space. And in a relational space, disagreement is not a power struggle or a violation of rights, but is something that must be solved through negotiation and humble mutual learning. And disagreement can be a problem, but there is an openness in a relational space that has an underground of trust undergirding the disagreement to working together to understand it. So I always say to my learners in the emergency job that your first job when you see a patient is establishment of trust. And lots of times that's pretty easy for the person with the sprained ankle or the laceration, just sort of being kind, and like that can sometimes be automatic. But in cases where patients are very afraid or very sick or where there's different values, you probably have to spend more time doing your first job, which is establishing trust. And without effective establishment of trust, everything you do from there on out will be hampered. And lots of the vulnerable populations I see at St. Paul's, the interaction between them and our hospital is so difficult because they walk in the door not trusting us. And so a key part of our job as physicians is to be people who steward and are experts at inspiring trust. What I want to say is that if we inspire trust between ourselves and our patients, this space becomes no longer a transactional, power-focused space, but a relational space where disagreement does not become a war of competing rights, but can hopefully be seen as an expression of care that can be solved through negotiation and mutual understanding. So I say no to patients all the time working in an emergency department who want their knee MRI or their inappropriate antibiotics or whatever. And I try to express to them, I am an expert in your health, and I respect that you know your body in some ways that I don't, but my job is to promote your health, and so I am trying to care for your best interest by saying no to this particular request. And people aren't always ecstatic about that, but my hope is that the articulating that in terms of what is good for them is part of that core task of inspiring trust. So that is my thought in the space between the physician and the patient, is that in our time this is often cast as an inherently tense power struggle, transactional kind of space, and we need to be people in our practice who enrich that space by conceiving it of a trusting relational space. How do we then try to enrich the space between ourselves and our colleagues? I think some of this has to do with reminding people that they have consciences. Because I think sometimes when people talk about conscience rights, they think like religious people have this thing called a conscience, and everyone else is just sort of value neutral and doesn't have a worldview. It is sometimes helpful in a warm, again, in the context of trusting ways, to remind people that everybody has deeply held moral commitments. Everybody has things that they place faith or trust in. I was having a conversation with one of the very senior emerge docs in my department, who I get along with very well. And we were talking about some of the tense ethical dilemmas we see in our emergency department, particularly around addictions. And she, as someone who's not a person of faith at all, and who would see herself as quite secular, was talking to me about her tension with wrestling with the idea of the disease model of addiction. And she used these exact words. She said, Quentin, I really believe in the disease model of addiction, that there's like no difference between, an opioid use disorder and diabetes. But there's this thing, like this little voice inside of me that keeps saying, that can't be quite right. And she literally said this. She said, I keep trying to push it down, but I just can't make it stop, that tiny little whisper inside of me. And I was like, Erin, that voice inside of you has a name. Like, that's a thing. But I tried to phrase it in an encouraging way. And using the language, people in our time are all about like trusting your gut. And I asked her, do you think that your moral intuitions should have a say? Do you really distrust them so much? I think those are really valuable. You're a really experienced emerge doc. You've worked in this department for 20 years. And I tried to sort of gently pull out of her this idea that she has a conscience, and why that might be really valuable for her, and why just listening to what she's told and trying to shove that down is not good for her wellness in the long run. And trying to build that trust so that down the line, if I have a hill that I decide to die on, and I appeal to my conscience, there will be some understanding that she is not a purely rational, objective person without a conscience dealing with this weirdo who's appealing to his conscience, but that everybody has a conscience. Everybody has a worldview. Everybody has deeply held moral intuitions about the good. The second thing that I try to do in this space between myself and my colleagues and some of the ethics spaces that I roll in is to try to explain the way that conscience is not just about interior, subjective, idiosyncratic moral feelings, but conscience is about a truth claim. So, for example, in the context that I work in, a number of my colleagues know that I wouldn't be interested in ending my patients' lives. And some of them have said to me in a way that I find initially as kind of patronizing, like, oh, you wouldn't be involved in MAID because of your conscience, right? And you can just like feel the eye roll behind that statement. And I say to them, like, my conscience is my moral intellect, so I suppose it has something to do with everything I do. But I'm not involved in MAID because I don't do things that I think are unhealthy for my patients, or MAID or anything else. If you can show me how MAID promotes the health of my patients, then I will do it, cheerfully, just like I will do anything else that I think promotes the health of my patients. But until someone can show me that, I won't do it. And in that sense, I am not grounding my practice in something subjective. I am grounding my practice in a claim to truth and connection to a notion that might be recognizable to them as important, like health. So that is some of the things that I do in terms of interacting with my colleagues to try to promote a more productive conversation around conscience. That is all that I had to say.
Okay. Well, we will move to the Q&A section. We've had a few submissions.
We'll actually even let you sit down.
Well, thank you very much. It's all good. I'd have you ask questions of me, but that wouldn't be very interesting. All right. Thank you both. So much to take in. Nicole, does our state have secular humility, a recognition that there are other truths to consider? I remember too, John Myers, Dr. John Myers. Maybe it's the fact I'm a grandpa now, but after his talk last year, I had a tear in my eye because it was like, wow, there was so much richness. Once it's legal, it's okay. And so for these people with mental illness, yeah, and we were talking actually last night too. There was a student, a medical student. I won't point him out. But he was saying he has a friend in that situation just waiting for the law to pass so that he can ask for MAID. Just waiting. He says, when that law gets passed, I'm going to go. That's what I'm waiting for. Once it's legal, it's okay. Feelings versus moral truth. Truth-telling with tenderness. Quentin, the intimidation of conscience discussion. Yeah. We can be intimidated. How do we fly under the radar and still stay true to our values? Establishing trust with patients, make it a transitional space, a transactional space. I like what you said about having not everything being a hill to die on. Yeah, and then well, what is that hill? I often have that discussion with my wife Mary, who's involved. In the nursing profession and dealing with people every day, everything. She says, I can't die on that hill. I have to choose the hill that I'm going to die on. I want this to be a long and productive career. Tell me how MAID contributes to the health of my patients. All good things to consider, and those were just a few things that I had taken. And maybe they'll prompt a few questions out there from you, either in-house or online. I believe we have one in-house right now. Take it away.
Thank you for the talk. I found it very informative. A bit of a long-winded question, but it seems to me legally, in a pragmatic sense, that conscience-based rights wouldn't be based on an objective truth, but rather subjective values that each person holds. And there are, for example, physicians in Quebec that we know of that are advocating for MAID for little children who are just newborns, and I think we'd agree that's wrong. So I think it's usually framed as, well, I'm not doing a certain act, as opposed to doing something that harms an individual. But then even thinking about that, people can argue, well, by not doing something, you're actually harming the individual, and I think that's appropriate in certain circumstances. So for example, withholding emergency care from an individual, I'd say you're actively harming that individual, even though your conscience position, for example, is withholding care. And I don't think people hold that position, but that's just a theoretical. So I guess my question is how, or like what kind of legal structure would be able to be applied, a mode of thinking or a philosophy that can distinguish between cases that are very obviously kind of harm that we would see as obvious, but perhaps other people wouldn't see as obvious, versus protecting conscious claims which other people would say, or the majority would say, do not have merit.
Take that. Or do you want a summary?
So I think in Canada, one of the problems around conscience claims is there's not really developed a significant jurisprudence or scholarly writing around how conscience claims play out. And so I think it's actually one of the problems that we have, is because people who dismiss conscience claims think that they apply in all sorts of situations that they think would be spurious, like ridiculous situations. Oh, that's a conscience claim. And so they don't really see the deep moral discernment that goes into conscience claims, and that they come from a moral imperative in the person. And I think that's one of the problems, is that we need to develop that by the writing that happens. And so I encourage people who are interested in this area to write in to their medical journals, to try and create and start that dialogue. There's not a lot of it in the legal journals either. I think that Derek Ross is doing a great job with Christian Legal Fellowship to try to put out some of those, like to create some of those scholarly articles, but there's just not a lot of that happening yet. And so I think it has to develop. And so that's why I think that 4-point framework that Marianne Waldron gave was really helpful as a way to start thinking about how we might develop creating that framework so that there's a more general understanding of what conscience is in Canada. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. We do have a lot of questions that are coming in here, so I'm going to ask you to hold up there just for 1 minute, and then we're going to kind of go back and forth between online and in the room just to give everybody a chance. Quentin, what do you say to a patient who thinks control/autonomy/avoidance of any form of suffering is more important than the value of their health, dignity, life?
I think the first thing I do is I try to establish trust, which I've said already, that someone who has that worldview, if they're speaking to me as an opponent, or if they see me as the man, so to speak, then we're not going to get anywhere. So the first thing is to try to make them believe that I care about them, and then to try to help interrogate together their understandings of what autonomy is. And a lot of people who have a worldview that's very autonomy-centric see dependence in itself as a failing, not just a sort of something that's abhorrent, but also in a sense as a moral failing, and that their value as a person is tied to their independence of everyone else. And that's part of what autonomy is, and that's how freedom is cast. Sometimes what that person needs is tender affirmation that they matter, even when they are sick and in pain, and that they're sort of clinging to their autonomous identity is because they're afraid. I do think this is maybe a bit of an aside when it comes to the expectation of being pain-free, specifically talking about pain and pain killing. There is an important, responsible word of medicine to reset people's expectations about pain. And some of all the, you can watch Dope Sick and we can talk about the opioid crisis, but one of the ways that medicine sort of went off the rails in the 20th century was this acceptance that part of our role is the role to serve consumers in their expectation to be pain-free all the time and to lead lives that have no pain or suffering. And that is an unrealistic expectation for human beings to have. And part of mature medicine is to recommend responsible approaches. So I was talking to someone about this last night, actually. Like, for example, if I see a patient who breaks their arm, I don't send them home with a prescription for opiates. I might send them home with 1 or 2 doses of opiates, but I have a very serious conversation with them about the harms versus the benefits, and I talk to them about an appropriate pain regimen, but I tell them, a broken arm will cause you severe pain for a little while. If you take this regimen, you can expect to have moderate pain. If you want me to cut your pain to 0, I think that will introduce unacceptable risk of greater harm into your life. And so that's not what I would recommend. Some people don't like that, but that is an expression of care for them. And I think that mature relational medicine has the ability to do that, where pure transactional medicine just says, here's your hydromorph script, bye-bye.
Yeah, well, what was the first quote you had, Nicole, in your presentation there about a doctor or a patient
Doctors
knows...
should just do what they're told.
Right.
Yeah. Quentin, you're clearly failing at that.
Did you want to say any more? We'll go.
No, Jeremy.
Okay.
Yep.
Jeremy.
Okay, hi. Yeah, my name is Jeremy. I'm doctor in St. Catharines, Ontario. So just sort of listening to you, I'm always trying to look at what perhaps the other side might think. So since religion often informs the conscience, you know, the duty to follow the conscience, but then also the duty to form your conscience well. Religion is often what informs conscience. Could this not be, you know, construed as something of a legal Trojan horse? Just another way that we sort of slip religion in and then just say, hey, this is conscience. So given that construal, kind of following up, if in fact they're kind of using that sort of logic that, say, okay, this is just another repackaged version of religion, you know, if they use the reasoning of, you know, the dignitary harm that may occur to a patient, if that was powerful enough to override religion, what's to say this won't override conscience as well in the legal framework?
Yeah, so I would argue that religion does not inform conscience. That you create, like, truth-seeking, reason, that informs your conscience. Your religious faith confirms to you that your conscience is right. It's kind of like another check. Because honestly, some people have the capacity to use their reason to create their conscience, and they can work it all through, and deep thinkers like Quentin could do that without religion. But maybe someone who's more simple like me, I can't think that through, but I have a deep faith, and so I don't have to spend the time trying to think through my conscience. I have enough confidence in my religious framework that it can inform my conscience. So it's another way, but I don't think it's the only way or even necessarily the first way. I would argue that conscience is not formed by, not necessarily formed by religious belief. It can be, but it's, you don't need to use religion to argue conscience claims.
Quinn.
Do you need a follow-up there? Because now you're going to argue with me, right, Jeremy?
We can save it for
Okay,
later.
okay.
But yeah, thank you for your time.
Do you want to comment on that? You notice you shaking your head but agreeing in the end. And...
Oh, sorry, I was just shaking my head. I definitely need religion to arrive at truth. So that was it.
Okay.
I think I have to think about it more. I think I agree with you that you don't necessarily need a religious faith to arrive at conscience claims. But I agree with you, Jeremy, that like a lot of people who look at the world through a hermeneutic of suspicion would see this kind of thing as a Trojan horse for imposing religious beliefs upon people.
I guess is the old, is the truth written on our hearts to begin with, you know? And then everything else forms around that. That's...
I'm just increasingly, like, I actually really agree with what Charlie Camusy said last night about how, you know, he formally tried to package the fact that he was a Catholic and a moral theologian in a more like secular frame to try to make it more acceptable. And now he's more interested in just being upfront that he has a worldview, but also so does everybody else. And he can articulate he can articulate humbly and specifically how his worldview creates a straight line, but from his worldview, which includes his religious beliefs, to moral language like compassion or dignity, to a specific medical practice. And not everybody else has to share that worldview, but they also have a responsibility to connect their worldview to their practice in a straight line.
Yeah, and I would say actually a religious formation like that makes it easier. Like I can, if I have a religious faith, I do have a religious faith, so I'm Catholic, I can say my religious faith tells me this, this, and this, and it creates my direct line from what I think to what I believe to how I act. And so I have coherence. I think it's much harder if you don't have a faith view to get that coherence. Not impossible, but way harder.
Okay, we'll swing over to online question here. Quentin said his nurse colleagues said they feel dead inside because of how often they're in morally distressing situations. If someone feels dead inside or morally, where and how do they resuscitate themselves in a moral sense? What are some ways to jumpstart their moral life again?
That's a wonderful question. I have two thoughts. The first thought is what I would call like compassion and satisfaction. Like I think I'm going to talk about this in my talk a bit, but sometimes people talk about compassion fatigue, and that can be misleading language in that it can suggest to people that compassion is something that's dangerous. In my experience, when people feel distress, it's because they encounter a situation where they feel strongly, but don't find a way to act out of those feelings in a way that is meaningfully helpful. They feel this empathetic feeling, this desire to help. They feel compelled by someone else's suffering, but then they don't successfully do anything to help. They don't take the step from a feeling to real compassion or burden bearing. And so sometimes what we need from our organizations or our hospitals is the opportunities to find ways to actually help. And so I try to encourage the patients, or encourage my nurse colleagues, if you see that 10th opiate overdose in a day, and you feel like all we're doing is just giving them their Narcan and a sandwich and booting them out the door, and we're just like watching these young people die over and over and over and over and over again, and they just feel destroyed by this. I tell them it's appropriate that you feel heartbroken about this. What we need to try to do is to find ways to meaningfully help. And so I've started some initiatives in our hospital where those patients come in. I can't fix everything, but where I can offer them, where I can feel like I've done what I can, as opposed to the Narcan and bye-bye pathway. So in that sense, I try to encourage them to find ways, when they do feel strongly, to find productive ways to act on that might help. The second thing I think is beauty. When people feel deadened or burnt out, to encourage them to have space in their life to interact with things that are beautiful.
I agree. I think beauty can really fill you, and you need to have it in your life, which is why we're at a beautiful hotel and giving you beautiful food so that you can be filled up with beauty and go back to your lives after this.
Beautiful. Ryan, yes.
That reminds me of a quote from Les Miserables that says, sometimes the beautiful is more useful than the useful.
Say that again?
Sometimes the beautiful is more useful than the useful. But that's not my question. My question is, I want to play devil's advocate for a moment to see how both of you respond, particularly in the legal difference here. And I think this came up in the CPSO case at one point, but let's take the hypothetical example of a doctor who feels deeply in their conscience that they can't participate in blood transfusions, and they're working in an emergency department where that decision to withhold a blood transfusion to a patient who needs it will actually result in serious harm to that patient. And I want to hear how legally and Quentin, how philosophically that's a different situation than what we're talking about with euthanasia and with abortion.
Quentin?
I mean, I think you point to something that's true, and that is that particular practices have particular goals. And so, for example, like a teleological frame of ethics would say, if you want to know what's good for something, you need to know what it's for. If you want to know what's good for a physician to do, you need to know what a physician is for. And somebody has to set the bounds of what a physician is for with certain things that are sort of absolute yeses and no. So another example of this is like questions of gender. So in our country, there have been people who've applied to medical schools who would say, I would never treat a woman for reasons of like personal or religious conviction. And we have appropriately said, sorry, you can't be a physician in our country, in our civilization, if you would never examine or treat a woman. And if that person appealed to their conscience, I think we would appropriately say, you cannot fall under the umbrella of what a physician is for in our context because of this particular conviction, which doesn't mean absolute judgment of you as a person, but it means that you cannot be included in this particular context. So I think that there totally is a line. For me, I would want to then draw a distinction between what you've described around the notion of health. And so this is maybe a bit of a broader conversation, but say the death and dying and the abortion questions, these historically were not included under the umbrella of what doctors did, not because of the notion of individual conscience, but because they contravened what a doctor was for, which was promotion of patient health. And so I think your devil's advocate question is excellent and well placed, that there are totally times when we say, you know, a physician with this conviction can't work in this setting, but I would say that accords to the underlying commitment of a physician to promote health. Yeah.
And that's why it goes to what, like, there's a certain element of what is true. And you have to get to that for conscience claims. They have to be grounded in truth and what the thing is for. And so with someone who won't do a blood transfusion, they are necessarily saying, I won't follow through on something that a doctor should do as part of health. And so I think that's where it's different from killing someone, because that's not really part of health, killing. Whereas, but I can see where you're going, because it gets, because the person who won't do a blood transfusion is arguing from their framework that this is something that they think is not good for you, and that's why they're not going to do it. But, and that's been litigated with the Jehovah's Witnesses, that from the other side, from the patient side, so when the patient is too young so when they're a child, the court can override the parents' wishes, but once someone is of an age of consent, they can choose not to have a blood transfusion. So I think it's a tricky place. It's probably one of the more difficult places to be, but it's really a religious claim more than a conscience claim.
Okay, imagine as this comes from online, from our, thank you, by the way, everybody who's watching online, you're firing these questions in there. They're great, so thank you for your engagement. Imagine a situation where abortion was decriminalized in our country, but most people believed abortion was wrong, and a physician made a claim that because of their deeply held moral beliefs, they had to provide abortion to help preserve the independence of their female patient. If conscience protection legislation was in place, what would be your response?
Well, abortion is decriminalized in our country. There's no law, so you can do whatever you want up until birth.
Right.
So what's...
If conscience protection legislation was in place.
But okay, so I don't
Okay.
see the conflict, because right now you can do what, like, there's nothing stopping you. Sorry, do you get it? Maybe.
Well, I think they're trying to flip the switch. They're saying, like, if the shoe was on the other foot,
Yeah.
would you still be that jazzed about conscience?
Okay,
Is that what they're saying?
yeah, we'll give it a go.
So I had an interesting interaction when I was in med school to this effect. So that I was like a second-year med student. We had some dumb small group thing where we had to talk about reproductive ethics or something. And I remember, trying to be Socratic and like trying to weasel my way through this. And I remember like inserting this idea of conscience increasingly and increasingly. And finally I talked about tried to sort of come through with the conclusion of my Socratic argument about the central importance of conscience in these kinds of issues. And the Obs-Gyn resident who was like supervising our little med student small group, she looked at me with this like elation on her face, and she was like, yeah, you're right, like Dr. Morgenthaler. And she was like, and then she wrote this hilarious, you get evaluated on these things. I got this evaluation from this resident being like, excellent medical student, critical thinker, progressive worldview. But it was a good experience for me.
You just never knew that you
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. She saw deeper into me than I saw into myself. But I think it is important to recognize when we talk about conscience that there are people who have consciences that compel them to do things that, that we would see as evil and morally wrong. And that is possible, that someone's conscience could be formed in a way that compels them to do something that we would see as wrong. And Aquinas, in like the history of Christian philosophy, picks up and considers this question quite a bit, both on the level of sort of individual judgment, but also on the level of how we should, as thinkers or as friends or whatever, interact with people like that. Interestingly, Aquinas would say that on the level of sort of an individual, if somebody does something immoral but in good conscience, they may be judged rightly by God. Maybe not to the degree of an evil like abortion, but in a lot of things. If someone does something wrong but in good conscience, on an individual level, they're less culpable, which is interesting. But he also goes to great degree to say that conscience is something that's accountable to truth. And so if somebody does something that's immoral and they say, well, my conscience compels me to do that, the proper response is to try to unpack the moral formation of that person to the degree where their conscience compelled them to do something that was wrong. Obviously, that is a process that requires trust.
Actually, Brian Bird, who's also a legal scholar on this, had this whole thing about the conscientious Nazi and how if they're following their conscience, then what they were doing was right. But I actually do not believe that there's such a thing as a conscientious Nazi. I think that if you're going towards evil, you've just somehow missed truth. Like you can't, it just doesn't exist. I think it's a red herring put out there to try and say that people who have immoral or evil designs somehow have a pure conscience. I just don't think that's true.
I think what you said, that it's one thing to say, oh, my conscience, overrode, but it's another thing to take the time to unpack it and really go further. Go ahead.
That's okay, and I totally agree with what you're saying. And even like I know some people in my context, some physicians who are really involved, say for example, in performing abortions, and I think they would superficially say my conscience is okay with this because they have this very narrow particular lens that won't allow them to consider the issue more holistically. And in a certain sense, they would want to say that they do so in good conscience, but actually that requires them not to think about the whole situation. And in that sense, part of engaging, to push that little voice down, exactly. And part of engaging with them is believing that little voice is there, however muted it might be, and then not hitting them over the head, but trying to cultivate the kind of space where that little voice inside them can be heard.
That little voice is a big one. We have a question from the room.
So hi, I'm Sunny. I'm a family physician in Saskatchewan. So thank you for your talk and so many thoughts with all the questions and answers. I'll try to be succinct. So I really appreciated your talk about how you engaged with your colleague about her little voice, and I think it made me think of word theft, how a lot of conversations these days, we actually have to go back and, okay, so what are we talking about? And I really liked that, explaining, okay, what is that little voice? It has a name, it's a conscience. So with that, and also living in a post-truth world, we talked about truth a lot, and it's really easy to have these discussions when we all agree that there's a truth, but we all know that that's less and less the conversation. I mean, at least what I'm frustrated and why I tend to sometimes be lazy and disengage in those conversations, because it almost hits a wall when you live in a post-truth world and you can't really actually move forward in these discussions. So how do you engage with that in the law, and how do we move forward in that when, and also, I guess, with your colleagues and patients, how do we engage when we live in a post-truth world?
I think that I'm less an expert on the law side of things, so I'll defer that to Nicole. I think that for me, there are these three ideas, the true, the good, and the beautiful, that all are powerfully compelling to human beings. And our age is like so sick of truth claims, and there are some bad philosophical reasons that undergird that cynicism, but that cynicism is there nonetheless. And even like the news, right? We have like competing news outlets and competing fact checkers and fact checkers of the fact checkers, and like it just becomes this like consumeristic swamp that's horrible for everybody, that produces cynicism and suspicion about the notion of truth or even fact in itself. I think that opens up the avenues of engaging people through the lenses of goodness and of beauty. And that is in the space between me and myself and my colleagues, even like trying to articulate with my colleague this sort of, she's trying to display compassionate care to our patients as someone who is affirms in theory the dogma of sort of like a disease model of addiction and harm reduction to the nth degree, but there's something in her that says that doesn't seem right. And in my opinion, the way to engage with someone like that is not using evidence or truth claims, but to try to appeal to the good and the beautiful for our vulnerable patients. And people who may be hard to convince about what is true, you might successfully be able to capture them by a beautiful vision, provided that it's paired with a witness of a beautiful life, which is always the core challenge for us.
Yeah, and I think in the law, first of all, that's really challenging because the law schools are pretty pathetic right now on the truth claims. But one area that's really interesting developing across the country is something called the Runnymede Society. I don't know if any of you have heard of it, but it is across in every law school now, lawyers or law students trying to work out these ideas of really essentially truth claims around the Constitution. So it's an opportunity to try to rebuild the legal culture. And I think in the long run it'll be successful, but it's a long run project or a long-term project, because in our universities and particularly in our law schools, it's all relative now, right? There's no truth, there's no objective truth. I mean, that's really, you can see that starting to slide into the medical schools, and that's kind of scary because you do want your doctors to go after things that are scientific and objectively true and they can measure against and all of that. And you're starting to see some of that push from the, what you would call more the woke culture into medicine. But it certainly has destroyed the legal profession right now. But there's hope. I think it's going to turn around.
Is the soundbite answer, though, individual witness? Like that's a really good question. How do we proclaim the truth in a post-truth world?
Yeah, I had this funny, it's another rambling anecdote, but I had this funny interaction. There's a guy who comes to St. Paul's emergency department almost every day, and he's a guy who threatens to be very litigious. He's like complained about every doctor in our department. He comes in with these non-specific complaints and requests all kinds of stuff, and if you don't give it to him, then he complains about you. And but he's just this very lonely person who his only way of interacting with people is by coming to the emergency department and threatening to sue us, which is not a great idea, but anyways. But one time I was driving home. I work at Lionsgate a little bit. I was driving home from Lionsgate at like 3 o'clock in the morning, and I saw this guy standing outside, the same patient, standing outside a Shoppers Drug Mart at 3 in the morning having a smoke. And I had to pick up diapers anyway, so I just like parked and went and said hi to him and had a smoke with him in the middle of the night outside the Shoppers, and we just like chit-chatted for a while. And since then, he loves me. He comes to the emergency department, he'll ask if I'm there. If I'm there, he'll come, and he's never complained about me. We just hang out for a few minutes, and then he leaves. But a number of our nurses, and like people in our department kind of know who I am and my worldview, and there's several people who previously I would say were not, who are quite cold to me, who have articulated, who have heard the story through the grapevine of me having a smoke with this guy, that they find that so compelling, and that they like want to get to know me a bit more and stuff. And this was just a reminder, and I get it wrong more than I get it right, but about how like there's no truth claim there. It's just like an act that pulls on people's instinctive sense of something that's good.
Okay, but I would argue that there is a truth claim there. The truth claim is that you're a human person worthy of my care.
Yeah.
And that is compelling, and it's shown out in the goodness and the beauty. Sorry.
Okay, we have, just so we know, we have about 3-4 minutes left. And we have 2 questions? Sure. All right, we'll try and squeeze in these, and we'll do our best. Anyway, carry on.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. My name's David Anderson. I'm not a medical professional. We're here for a session later in the afternoon. But I did have the privilege of serving in Parliament for 20 years, and I just wanted to kind of update you. I think it might be important to hear what's happened there. In 2015, I was drawn as part of the private members bill queue, and we brought forward a protection of conscience bill that specifically targeted medical personnel, protecting them from being intimidated or compelled to participate in MAID, and it was deliberately done on a narrow focus. We got it to the House for speeches. It was not voted on before the Parliament died out. Kelly Block has since taken that up twice in 2 parliaments, so she brought it forward in the 2019 Parliament. Again, it did not get, because of the time, to a vote. It did come up to a vote in this Parliament on October 5th, and it was defeated along party lines. And so, I mean, I want to just acknowledge Kelly's work in keeping this on the burner, because it's important that we continue to pressure members of Parliament so that they understand that this is an issue and it's an ongoing issue or whatever. But I thought it may be of some value to people to understand this is still an issue federally. It has suffered a setback because of the loss, but there's still a group of MPs who will support this and step forward on it.
David, you're stealing Kelly's thunder because she's coming to speak to us just before your session this afternoon, just to tell us about that. But yeah, for sure, it's on our radar federally. It's also on our radar provincially, and so we're working on that as CPL. So.
Also, I just want to say there's this one particular MP whose name is Garnet. Please write him annoying emails, harass him as much as you like. I can give you his address if you want.
Can you give us his personal address, his personal cell phone?
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead, Rachel.
Hi, I'm Rachel. I am a second-year master's student in the area of counseling at the University of Alberta. And here, this is all beautiful and compelling to me, but here's a question that I perceive coming from an opponent. Sure, when a patient asks a doctor for antibiotics and they are inappropriate, the doctor has the right to deny the request because the doctor is an expert on the body. But what makes a doctor an expert on what is ultimately good for the patient, existentially and otherwise? Why should a doctor's belief about what is good for the patient override what the patient thinks is good for themselves?
I love all the devil's advocate questions, by the way. That's really good. So I would say, of course, a doctor isn't an expert on what's good and right. And I think one of the great problems of medicine in our time is the overreach of medicine. And this is a really interesting, dialogue to trace over time. But even if you look at the French Revolution, how after they overthrew the government, people went looking around. There's essays where people write about this, okay, we've removed the priests as a class from society. Who can we, but we know that people need priests. Who can we find that can fill the role of a priest? Oh, doctors. People like doctors. Doctors have goodwill. And you even see in our time, I learned in med school, a biopsychosocial spiritual model of care of medicine. That's hot garbage. I'm not an expert in biopsychosocial spiritual care. I can't tell people what's good for them in an ultimate sense. And part of the momentum behind the autonomy movement was this suspicion that physicians were peremptory and imperious, were extending beyond the lines of their narrow expertise into things that they weren't experts on. Interestingly, this is also part of the move of medicine to being involved in abortions and MAID. That these aren't healthcare in that they accord to health, they are attended to other perceived goods that don't have anything to do with the individual health, but have to do with commitments to larger existential goods. Coming back around to your question at some length, I would want to say that it is of course true that a physician is not an expert, but again, if a patient comes to me and says, I want antibiotics, I will say to them, I don't do things that are against your health. Your feeling about your sore throat does not compel my action. I would say the exact same thing about a patient who wanted their life to end. I cannot tell them the absolute meaning of their life. I can try to share with them how I perceive meaning in my own life and beauty and truth, etc. But I, of course, cannot impose upon them one perspective of the good or force them or coerce them to one particular action. But by the same token, they cannot compel me to do something that I think is contrary to their health.
Got 2 minutes.
2 minutes. So that was actually one of the underlying reasons in Carter the lawyer that was arguing to overturn the euthanasia laws wanted doctors to be involved in deciding who lived or died because he had this great faith that doctors were kind of some superhuman, see-all, know-all kind of personality that could make these decisions, and there would be no prejudice, no discrimination, no ableism. Like, it would be so beautiful because doctors are somehow so special. And I think it's right. It conflates doctors with God. And so that's a big problem. And I think that's where you get that pushback from, like, I don't want my doctor to tell me how to live my life. I just want you to fix my health. And so I think there's a tension and a development in medicine that was unhealthy for medicine.
Sorry, just one more thing. This is why I think it's so extra important that we emphasize amongst ourselves the stewardship of trust. Because we are going to see over the next generation or two a collapse of societal trust in the beneficence of physicians. And I have
Can you say that again, what you just said? Over the next
generation or two, we are going to see a collapse in the societal trust in the beneficence of physicians. Because physicians and health policy is increasingly motivated by resource allocation concerns, by economic concerns, by determining how people should be treated based on their number of quality life years next, and an increasingly non-humanistic, patient-centered view of medicine. And I have been so disappointed with all the MAID stuff, less so by the political and legal aspect, which is not my area of expertise, but by physicians. And I was giving rounds to McGill Psychiatry Department or something, and someone said in that context about the law changing, that like, well, we're not all that happy about the law changing for people with mental health disorders, but as physicians, we have to respond to the law. And I said, why? Why can't you say, the government made this legal, but that's not what doctors do? In the United States, like, capital punishment is legal, but physicians in the United States say, we will not participate in capital punishment. That's legal, that's fine, we're not the government, but that's not what physicians do. So I have been disappointed that physicians have so easily said, this is legal, therefore we will be involved in it, instead of having a real professional ethic that says, sure, a bunch of people in Ottawa can raise their hands, that does not compel us to change our entire professional ethic. But our collusion in this, which is a completely ableist, discriminatory, economically motivated policy, over time, the voices will only get louder, and this will lead to a catastrophic loss of trust in physicians, which only impresses on us more the importance of, in our care spaces, being people who excel at stewarding trust.
Okay, Everett, pull that last 3 minutes, put it online. We want it on there now. That was excellent. That was really great way to wind up this session. Could we have a moment of appreciation here for our two panelists, two speakers? We're going to hear from Quentin again very shortly. And Nicole, of course, will be with us all weekend. For those of you online, we're moving you to a breakout room where you can have a break, get to know each other a little bit more, or grab a refreshment. Here we will have a coffee break for 15 minutes. And what was it, half an hour? Oh, there you go. My bad. Half an hour. You have a full half hour to refresh yourselves, grab a coffee. Thank you very much. We will be back.